Well, One Piece fans, we made it. After nearly 4 years of serialization, One Piece's Wano arc has finally come to a close, and what a ride it's been. As One Piece's longest arc at a whopping 148 chapters, this arc has had some of the most iconic and divisive moments in the entire series. I started One Piece in March of 2020, back when the Wano arc was only about halfway done, and it's surreal to see it finally come to an end. A lot of opinions have been thrown around about the quality of this arc over the course of its runtime, but I think these sorts of things are best analyzed as a whole. And now that Wano is over and Oda is gearing up for the final saga, now is the perfect time to look back and analyze the good, the bad, and the unexpected in this monumental arc. Naturally, this video will contain major spoilers for the Wano arc, and One Piece as a whole up to chapter 1057. Let's get started. Part 1. The Plot. Many fans are already familiar with the Joe-Ha-Q theatrical narrative structure and how the Wano arc utilizes and subverts it, so I'll be brief. I think it's fairly brilliant what Oda has done with this structure, to put it lightly. Joe-Ha-Q is a theatrical narrative structure with its origins in medieval Japan, so it makes sense for Wano to follow that structure as it is based in that period. The first two acts of Wano follow this structure well, with a low-stakes introduction to the setting and themes followed by a fast-paced escalation of events. But it's the third act where things get interesting. In traditional Joe-Ha-Q, the third act is the dramatic climax of the story, punctuated by a profound tragedy, which is exactly what happens when the Akazaya 9 are thoroughly defeated by Kaido. However, Joe-Ha-Q is just the story of the samurai in the land of Wano, so when Luffy and the Straw Hats get involved, they turn the traditional structure on its head and make their own story in its wake. It's really fitting with the overall themes of the series and the way that Luffy does things in general. Great stuff that the average reader might not pick up on. All that said, however, this framing does lead to some misleading expectations and issues with pacing, especially if you're reading weekly like I was. Quite frankly, the long-winded pacing in the latter half of Onigashima was quite irritating to go through at points, and I felt about ready to wrap things up about 10 or 15 chapters before they actually did. And I honestly think this feeling would have been mitigated if Onigashima was considered its own arc independent of Wano. I mean, if Water 7 and Enies Lobby can be considered two separate arcs, then so can Wano and Onigashima, I say. But that's neither here nor there, really. Arc and Saga Division is mostly up to Shueisha anyways, and their choices aren't agreeable to some people anyways. So if you're reading this arc for the first time, just go into it with the mindset that it's essentially two arcs in one, and that should make it somewhat easier to swallow. Oda introducing literally dozens of new characters in this arc certainly didn't help its length either. This is a subject that I'm personally conflicted on, because I really like a lot of the new characters added in this arc. Ashura Doji, Kikunojo, and Kawamatsu to name a few. But I also recognize that they're not strictly necessary for the story to progress. The contributions of a lot of these characters could have been accomplished by either already established characters or just plot circumstances. I'm concerned as to how Oda is going to balance new characters and concepts with the pacing of this series, especially if he wants to wrap things up in 3 years like he says. But enough negatives, let's get back to some more things that I enjoyed. Act 1 of Wano was a fun little mini-story about Luffy entering Wano and discovering the truth about its condition through his interaction with Otama, Bakura Town, and the samurai. It felt reminiscent of a lot of old western-type movies, as well as the best parts of classic One Piece arcs in a compact package. But beyond that, it is an excellent setup for the upcoming climactic battle. The battle, quote-unquote, between Luffy and Kaido was a perfect way to demonstrate the true difference between Luffy and a proper Emperor of the Sea. Act 2 is where things start ramping up for real. This section of the story does a very good job with balancing its multiple plotlines and POVs, between Luffy's prison training, Zoro's escapades to retrieve Shusui, Big Mom's entrance into Wano, and the rest. They all meld well into one cohesive narrative, weaving in and out of each other in a natural way. The tension and hype builds up very naturally in this arc as well, with new complications arising up in their fight as well as new unforeseen advantages. All of it, of course, is in service of making the third act of this arc as bombastic as possible. But, does it pay off is the question. Before I answer that question, let's cover the Odin flashback portion of the arc, which I consider to be a sort of Act 2.5. It's a touching tale of the life and times of one deeply fascinating man, Kozuki Odin, who I'll talk about more in depth later. But needless to say that this flashback made me care deeply about his decisions, all the lives he touched, and his ultimate fate. I laughed, I cried, and got even more hyped for the final battle to come, suffice to say. And now we get to Act 3, the real meat of the story, and the one that most people seem to be talking about, both in the positive and the negative. I will admit that I found this section of the story to be challenging at parts, particularly the latter half, which really feels like a drag at some points. But the first part of this arc has a really nice pace that ramps up the tension in a natural way, setting up the conflicts that will occur later and containing some of the most hype moments in the entire series. However, I feel like things start to get a bit repetitive around the time the solo battles start. For those who've read the Bleach manga, this is a similar issue I had with the 1,000-Year Blood War arc. It just kind of becomes a series of battles without that much connective tissue or breathing room, which can get tiring after a while. There were parts that I thought could have been expanded on, like the Big Mom versus Law and Kid fight, and parts that could have been shortened or cut entirely, like the climax of the Gear 5 fight. Speaking of which, this is a section that I'd like to call the Gear 5 Corner, where I talk about the most significant and controversial development of this arc, and possibly the entire series. As it turns out, Luffy's Devil Fruit is not just the Paramecia type Gomu Gomu no Mi, but also the mythical Zoan type Hito Hito no Mi model Sun God Nika. For as much hype as this reveal generated, it also produced a significant amount of backlash, claiming that it ruined Luffy's character or cheapened his past achievements. When this chapter came out, I too was extremely concerned about how this would affect Luffy's character arc, especially since I've seen other protagonists fall into a similar issue. But I've since come to appreciate this turn of events, and I think it has a lot of narrative potential to bring the climax of the series to the next level. To explain my change of heart, I'll compare Luffy's Gear 5 to a similar power-up from a similarly famous series. That is, the 6-Pass Sage Mode transformation from Naruto. This comparison got thrown around a lot back when the chapter first came out, and it's easy to see the similarities at a glance. Both have the main character gaining a sort of godly status, both involve the main characters being revived from near death, and both involve the inheriting of the will/soul of a legendary figure. However, unlike 6-Path Sage Mode, Gear 5 feels less like a cheap Deus Ex Machina and more like a genuine achievement of Luffy's and the next step in his thematic thoroughline, for a few reasons that I'll talk about here. 1. Devil Fruit Awakening and Mythical Devil Fruits are both established concepts within the One Piece universe. In Naruto, there was absolutely zero precedent for a character receiving godly powers from their past selves via ancient chakra demigod, so it feels like something that was just thrown in at the last minute. Luffy's awakening is something that fans have been looking forward to for years, and some had even theorized that he would awaken this arc to defeat Kaido. The fact is that it just looked a little different than what we were expecting. 2. It wasn't just given to Luffy, it was the result of his hard work and resolve. In Naruto, it's implied that Hagoromo, the ancient chakra demigod mentioned earlier, would have given Naruto the power of the 6 paths no matter what, purely because he was the reincarnation of Ashura. Not because of anything he's done or how hard he's worked. In One Piece, Devil Fruits can only be awakened after mastering its powers to the utmost limit, which takes years of training and hardship to accomplish. And I have to add, even if Luffy's fruit even is a secretly powerful mythical Zoan once awakened, it acts pretty much just like an ordinary mediocre Paramecia before that point. It was thanks to Luffy's creativity and joyful attitude that he managed to draw out the Gomu Gomu no Mi's full potential, where, it's implied, many people failed in the past. 3. It's not a literal reincarnation, just a sort of inherited will. Naruto is the literal reincarnation of Ashura. It's mentioned multiple times in the text. From this, you could argue that Naruto's character arc was set in stone basically from the get-go. There wasn't ever a time where he wasn't destined to become what he eventually does. Luffy was just an ordinary boy who happened to be in the right place at the right time to receive the Gomu Gomu no Mi. Sure, he has the will of D, but that has nothing to do with Nico or Joy Boy, as far as we know, and it's a trait he shares with several other members of the cast. He developed his own ideals and worldview that just so happened to align with the ideals of Joy Boy, and that's why he was the one to awaken that devil fruit instead of all those before him. To put it more succinctly, Naruto inherited Ashura's will because he's the protagonist, and Luffy is the protagonist because he chose to inherit Joy Boy's will. I hope this little rant has enlightened you as to why I think the Nika twist works on a storytelling level. Don't worry, I'll be coming back to this topic very shortly. In the meantime, let's move on to Part 2. The Characters. This arc has a lot of characters and a lot of great character moments, so I'll be going over individual highlights one by one, starting with the Straw Hats. What can I even say about Luffy? He's always been the most consistent character in the series, and Wano was not one to disappoint. Our very own Rubber Boy is in top form this arc, with great moments at every juncture of the story. From Act 1, Luffy shows a great deal of his character growth from the time skip and how he interacted with Otama. Luffy had every reason to bring up his relationship with Ace to her, and a past version of Luffy might have even broken down. But he had the emotional intelligence to not make the situation about himself and acknowledge Otama's feelings as valid. At the same time, him ripping off the proverbial band-aid about Ace's death makes sense from his viewpoint, since he knows firsthand that living with false hope and denial won't get you anywhere. It's all fantastic character writing on Oda's part that tells you so much about Luffy's newfound maturity. Aside from that, his rampage in Bakura Town was thoroughly entertaining, and his quote-unquote fight against Kaido effectively set up for how far he had to go to challenge him. Moving on to Act 2, Luffy continues to bring joy and determination to the people around him wherever he goes, even in the harsh and authoritarian Udon prison. His training and with Hyogoro was extremely satisfying, and his burgeoning rivalry with Kid seems to have a lot of potential. And how can I talk about this part without mentioning his badass speech to rouse the prisoner's spirits? That's an all-time favorite Luffy moment right there. Finally, the Onigashima raid. It's fair to say that this arc gave Luffy his largest growth in terms of power. Even setting aside Gear 5, his acquiring of Ryuo and later Coded Conqueror's Haki brought him all the way up from barely above Katakuri to nearly in the same league as Odin, to the point that Kaido acknowledges him as someone with the potential to break through the established ceiling of power. Impressive to say the least, and it all felt very natural from a writing standpoint. I would have been content with Luffy's growth just from that, but of course Oda's gotta go above and beyond. Looking back, Gear 5 and the Nika reveal is so appropriate for Luffy's character. I highly doubt that Oda thought of this more than an arc or two beforehand, but you could almost argue that he laid the groundwork even before the time skip, due to Oda's incredible storytelling and thematic consistency. The idea of Luffy being the literal embodiment of liberation and laughter is so fitting for his arc, and it opens the door for a ton of narrative options in the future. Anyways, his awakened fight against Kaido was a ton of fun to read with plenty of excellent visual gags. Hopefully this opens the door to a lot more creative final fights in One Piece's future. And Luffy's final declaration of wanting to make a world where his friends would never go hungry while slamming down Kaido into the earth gave me chills when I reread it. What a finisher indeed. Now that Luffy is a full-fledged emperor, I can't wait to see how he'll shake up the world next. To be completely honest, I was expecting a lot more from Zoro in this arc. After Whole Cake Island massively expanded upon Sanji's backstory and motivations, effectively redeeming his character in my eyes, I was hoping Zoro would get a similar treatment, possibly even more extensive considering how deeply Zoro has been linked to Wano both aesthetically and thematically. But looking back, we really didn't get all that much. Zoro got a fancy new sword as a power-up, and we, the readers, got some extra lore regarding Zoro's home village and a possible connection to the Shimotsuki clan. Heck, we still don't even know who Zoro's parents are, or if that's even relevant. Either way, I think this arc would have benefited from some more introspective moments with Zoro, where he considers his connection to Wano and how it relates to his promise to Kuina, among other things. Something in that vein would have been excellent character development for Zoro, who I feel has been somewhat stagnant since the time skip. That's not to say I didn't greatly enjoy what we did get from him in this arc. The opening scene of him killing the magistrate was excellent, and a perfect encapsulation of what I love about his character. His reunion with Luffy was absolutely heartwarming, and his escapades with Hiyori were cute and funny to boot. Losing Shusui was an interesting challenge for Zoro to face, but I think that Enma will be a much better fit for him in the long run, and his struggle with taming the sword in the heat of battle was immensely satisfying to watch. Speaking of battles, Zoro's fight against King was excellent, definitely one of Zoro's better fights in the series. I've always thought that Zoro's character is at its best when he's beaten to shit and on the brink of death, and this battle was no exception. Between pushing his body well past its limits thanks to Chopper's drug, and Enma literally draining his life force away, I think it's fair to say that this is the most damage that Zoro's taken at once since his encounter with Kuma's Ball of Pain. Additionally, Zoro deciphering King's weakness and how to beat him gave me a lot of the same vibes as Zoro vs. Mr. One, which I consider to be his best fight in the series. In the end, Zoro managed to use his wits and his newfound Conqueror's Haki to take down the second-in-command of the Beast Pirates in spectacular fashion. Finally, I couldn't talk about Zoro this arc without mentioning his stellar performance during the rooftop battle. Him being able to deflect a combo attack from 2 Emperors and live was certainly a shock, and a testament to his dedication and strength. The return of Ashura in Chapter 1010 was pure hype, and to top it all off, he managed to put a massive wound on the strongest creature alive. If that doesn't earn him MVP of that battle, I don't know what does. All in all, though I wish we had gotten a little bit more, Zoro's role in Wano was truly epic and satisfying to watch. Nami certainly had some memorable moments in the latter half of this arc. Obviously, there was her declaring her loyalty to Luffy in front of Ulti, which was a top-tier character moment that really went to show just how far she's come. That said, I do think her fight against Ulti was somewhat lacking. I do understand the power difference in the fact that Nami's narrative role isn't in fighting, but man, I miss getting to see Nami kick some ass. It's always a lot of fun when she's forced to use her wits and unique power set to defeat a strong opponent. And it felt like we didn't really get to see a whole lot of that here. She spent most of the quote-unquote fight running away with Usopp and trying to widen the distance between the two of them, which got old pretty quickly. Big Mom ended up doing most of the damage to Ulti, and Nami won almost purely because of a cheap shot from her new power-up. Speaking of which, despite what I just said, I do think that Zeus is a good addition to Nami's arsenal. If utilized correctly, he could offer Nami a lot of new opportunities to fight creatively. Hopefully, Nami will get that elusive quality solo fight in the future. I'll be honest, Usopp really got sidelined in this arc. He doesn't get much attention in Acts 1 and 2, and spends most of Onigashima playing second fiddle to Nami in their fight against Ulchi in page 1. The only kind of compelling moment I can think of from this arc was him defending Kiyomon and Kiku and telling them to keep living, which was a neat character moment. There wasn't even any mention of Usopp's new observation haki, which seems like a huge missed opportunity. All in all, not much to say here. Hopefully Elbaf will give him more time to shine and vindicate his character. Sanji continues on with his excellent character development from Whole Cake Island in this arc, and we got to see just how much his Vinsmoke heritage will continue to affect his character and worldview going forward. His first use of the raid suit was really badass, and it's a shame that we'll probably never see this design again, but more on that later. His relationship with Otoko was also cute, but other than that, not much to say about Sanji in Acts 1 and 2. Act 3 is where things start to get interesting character-wise. The first major character moment that I'd like to talk about is, of course, Sanji getting captured by Black Mariah and needing to be saved by Robin. This moment divided the fans when it came out, and I can safely say that I think this moment is great. A big portion of Sanji's character arc, even since Baratier, has been about his unhealthy sense of self-sacrifice. He's always been one of the first to put his life on the line when the crew is in trouble. This trait of his is what led to the entirety of the Whole Cake Island arc, in which he tries to deal with his arranged marriage and abusive family on his own while keeping the crew at arm's length. And it's in this moment that we see the effects of the lessons that he's learned from that experience. Instead of taking the hits and possibly getting himself incapacitated, he chooses to rely on his crewmates to help where he can't and instead focus on what he can do. It's a brilliant moment that harkens back to the major themes of the series, and Sanji's character arc all at once. As for Sanji's big fight against Queen, it was a lot of fun to watch, with the twist on the fight being extremely compelling. That is, Sanji having to fight against the internal dilemma of finally inheriting his Germa enhancements, while also fighting the external threat of a giant cyborg Brachiosaurus. Some people think that Sanji's sudden power-up wasn't earned, but it's important to remember that Sanji didn't want it either. Him awakening his latent modifications was the last thing that he ever wanted, and his arc during this fight was about accepting these new powers and confronting his heritage head-on. It was very well done in my opinion, and I think that it could open up some very interesting story possibilities in the future. Surprisingly, Chopper was one of the standouts of this arc. Similarly to Sanji, I felt as though Chopper got somewhat flanderized after the time skip, and Oda didn't give him all that much to do other than look cute and heal the crew every now and then. But in Wano, Chopper actually got a chance to show off some of his better characterization. Being the youngest of the crew, Chopper has always been inclined to follow behind his crewmates, but this arc gave Chopper the opportunity to grow into being a leader himself. We got to see a glimpse of this in Act 2 with his plan to lure Big Mom into Udon, and eventually curing the mummy virus outbreak, which would become a hint of much more to come. And of course, in Act 3 we have Chopper's countering of Queen's Ice Oni virus, which I consider to be one of the all-time highlights of his character. I always enjoy seeing Chopper vehemently decry the unethical use of science and medicine, and it really serves to make his character stand out in a world full of moral grays. It also served to highlight one of the main themes of the arc, and really the series as a whole, that valuing people and their well-being will always lead to better results in the future. Queen sacrificing the pleasures and the waiters to the virus turns them all against Queen, and Chopper's dedication to saving lives and curing disease brings them all over to the Alliance's side. It's an excellent display of character and a great moment for Chopper to shine in an unexpected area. Now, anyone who knows me knows that I am a huge Robin fanboy, and you would also be able to guess how thrilled I am that Robin got her first solo fight in over a decade in this arc. Robin vs. Black Mariah was probably my favorite of the Toby Roppo fights, with a lot of fun back and forth and some new cool moves from Robin. Additionally, it was a good way to display her character growth from when she first joined the crew, from having to find her resolve to live back in Ennis Lobby, to putting her life on the line and defending her comrades in the present. Great development that I honestly wasn't expecting. Obviously, Robin plays a large part in the lore developments of this arc, so I'll be talking more about that later. For now, it's safe to say that Robin had a satisfactory role in this arc with some surprising high points. In my opinion, Frankie and Brooke had about an equal amount of relevance in this arc, that is to say, not very much, so I figured I'd talk about them both here. I'm not particularly bothered by their lack of presence since they don't have a lot of thematic stake in this arc, well, except maybe Frankie. We'll get back to that. Both of them were thoroughly enjoyable in this arc and had some fun gags in Acts 1 and 2. Once we arrive in Act 3, we of course have the badass moment of Frankie and Brooke running into Big Bomb with his motorcycle. Gotta give them some respect for that. Then there's Frankie's fight against Sasaki, which of course had some fun mech action and special dinosaur anatomy to boot. And though Brooke didn't get a solo fight in this arc, he was pretty badass tag-teaming Robin and cleaning up the gifters in one attack. At long last, Jinbei has finally joined the Straw Hats for good, after over a decade since he initially was invited. Jinbei has been a favorite of mine for some time now, and it was great to see him finally alongside the whole crew properly. His fight against Who's Who was sufficiently entertaining, if a bit wordy. I'll talk more about the lore implications of this later, but needless to say they were quite intriguing. I'm glad Jinbei got some time to shine in this arc, and I'm looking forward to his interactions with the crew as the story progresses. And now for some of the standout side characters. Law has been a fan favorite and an honorary Straw Hat for many years now, and this arc certainly solidified the former in many's eyes. It really is something to see this plan that he set in motion over 400 chapters ago finally come to fruition. You could argue that even Law himself wasn't expecting to make it this far. But now, he's finally come far enough to be able to fight alongside Luffy to become one of the greatest powers in the Grand Line. In Act 2, Law demonstrated his value and dedication to his crew when he refuses to let them be tortured for information and instead takes their place. It's a touching nod to the fact that Law has just as much respect and love for his crew as Luffy does, even though he appears at the outset to be the much more utilitarian and logical of the two. And of course, Act 3 showed Law's full combat potential and the sheer power of his Devil Fruit. The way he teleports himself and his teammates around the battlefield and bypasses his opponent's defenses really sets him apart from the other brute force fighters of the worst generation. And of course, his Devil Fruit Awakening has loads of potential, possibly more than any other. We see him cause massive internal damage and even mimic the late Rocinante's Devil Fruit, so who knows what else he could do with this ability if he got a little creative. It'll be sad to see this beloved character leave the crew after being such a fixture of the cast for so long. But if his interest in the poneglyphs means anything, we likely haven't seen the last of Trafalgar Law. Kid and Killer were a welcome addition to the Wano arc, which gave them both some much-needed development, both power and character-wise. We got to see an interesting, more vulnerable side of Killer in his Kamazo persona. The absolute dedication that he has to Kid, to the point of self-mutilation and murder, makes me very intrigued to see the past of these characters. Likewise, it was touching to see the otherwise gruff and abrasive Kid standing up for Killer and being considerate about his laugh, which he knows Killer is sensitive about. It's a great reflection of the themes of One Piece, showing that morally questionable characters like Kid and Killer can still have deep loyalty and dedication to each other and their dreams, setting them apart from the more cynical and opportunistic villains of the series. Moving on to Act 3, these two have a surprisingly impressive showing against Kaido, actually doing some real damage alongside their worst generation contemporaries. And once they get split up, Killer has a compelling fight against Hawkins, where he shows off a surprising amount of cunning and forethought for someone of his namesake, not to mention continuing to demonstrate his dedication to his captain. Speaking of which, Kid finally beat the useless Captain Mid allegations with his performance against Big Mom. While at first glance it may seem like Law fully carried the fight, it's clear that Big Mom considered both of them to be equally threatening to her in a fight. His Devil Fruit Awakening has some great potential, and his Damned Punk attack may be one of my new favorites in the series. Anyways, now that Law seems to be exiting the main story, at least for now, I hope that Oda will continue to develop the Kid Pirates into genuine rivals for the Straw Hats in the coming arcs. Now, full disclosure, I will be referring to Yamato with he/him pronouns throughout this video. Before anyone in the comments brings up databooks or anything else, I will say that I am familiar with what the supplementary material says about Yamato. However, I consider the manga to be the supreme source of canon, more so than the databooks. And I think it is exceptionally clear from the manga's text that Yamato does in fact identify as a man, his infatuation with Odin notwithstanding. That said, I do understand my own bias on the topic, as well as the inherent ambiguity with which Oda has written this character. I do think that one could make a compelling argument either way. So if you think Yamato is more of a she or her, fine, more power to you for that. All I ask is that everyone remain civil and try to respect everyone's takes on the subject. With that out of the way, whether you're Team Waifu or Team Husbando, I think we can all agree that Yamato is great. He has an infectious energy that fits in so well with Luffy and the rest of the crew. Not only that, but his backstory is extremely compelling and gives him a good reason to take on the role of Odin, and his connection with Ace adds another layer of tragedy and thematic connectivity to the story. Speaking of which, it turns out Yamato is strong as hell, which I wasn't expecting. As the son of the world's strongest creature, it should be no surprise, but I was certainly impressed with his ability to go one-on-one with Kaido for several minutes. I could see him taking a top-tier role alongside Zoro and Sanji by the end of the series. I think it's a shame that he won't be joining the Straw Hat crew, at least for the time being. But the more that I think about it, this is probably for the best. It makes sense that Yamato would second-guess his desire to travel with the Straw Hats and instead decide to see Wano and the outside world on his own terms. It also gives Jinbei some time to settle into his role with the Straw Hat crew without having to share the spotlight with another. I just wish that Oda had shown more of Yamato's introspection and the rationale that led to his decision, as it kind of ends up feeling last minute and out of nowhere in chapter 1057. This kind of off-screening and rushing through character arcs is a recurring problem in Wano, especially in the denouement of Act 3, so I'll probably talk more about it later. Even though it'll be sad to see Yamato go, it was a treat to have him around while we did. Carrot has been in a weird position for me ever since Whole Cake Island, where she's kind of hovering in between becoming a crew member and doing her own thing. Personally, I've never been the biggest fan of her character. It's not that I hate her or anything, it's just that there hasn't really been anything all that interesting or deep about her to latch onto, unlike some other late game additions to the cast. Her Sulong form is pretty neat, I'll admit, but that's just an aesthetic appreciation and doesn't add much to her actual character. Sadly, this arc didn't do much to raise my opinion of Carrot. She almost had a cool moment when fighting against Perospero, but she got beaten off screen and Nekomamushi stepped in to take the kill. Not a good look, I'm sorry to say. It looks like she'll be going back to Zou to become the Duchess of the Kingdom, so this may be the last we see of Carrot for quite some time. Hopefully she comes back in the future for some other arc, or else I may have to admit that she was somewhat of a wasted character. I'll talk about the Scabbards as a whole here, minus Conjuro, since they kind of work best as a unit. I like the Scabbards a lot, needless to say, even though I mentioned earlier that I feel like they weren't all fully necessary for the story to function. But hey, that is one of Oda's strongest writing talents, to make even the most unassuming side characters compelling and endearing. Anyhow, I thought it was really compelling to see how Oda inspired all these misfits and ne'er-do-wells to improve themselves and form a real family. It really helps the audience understand their fierce devotion they have for their lord later on in the story, even with all his quirks and recklessness. They were all interesting and unique enough that I could see how they stand on their own as the heroes of the story. And while I think it would have been more impactful if more of them had died during the raid, Kiyamon, this is still One Piece, so I should probably be glad that any of them died at all. Still, it's a shame that Ashura Doji was the one who had to die. He was actually one of my underrated favorites of that arc, and I really sympathized with his story. And of course, Oda couldn't resist killing off another one of the Whitebeard pirates to give Marco some more trauma. And while we're on the subject, I would just like to add how much I appreciate a character like Kikunojo. Seeing such a respectable and genuine representation of trans people in this series is really a pleasant surprise, especially considering One Piece's somewhat controversial history with the subject. It's always refreshing to see an artist continuing to improve and broaden their horizons even after 20 years. So, good job, Oda. Keep it up. It's really been something to see this little kid grow and mature from a weak-willed and traumatized young boy into an inspiring and determined leader. The growth he went through in this arc alone was really inspiring, but also a little tragic when you think about it. This 8-year-old kid basically had to go through the worst 2 or 3 months of his life, and now he doesn't even get to enjoy the rest of his childhood and adolescence before being thrust into the role of a leader. Luckily, it seems like he'll have plenty of people to guide him and help him overcome the challenges ahead of him. It'll be weird to see such a fixture of the story leave after all this time, but Luffy's dialogue at the end of this arc seems to indicate that we'll be seeing him again in the future. Hiyori was this arc's princess in distress character, which is a trope Oda likes to use to give the main cast additional personal investment in the conflict. It's a trope that I think works to varying degrees of success, and I initially thought that Hiyori was going to be the more generic instances of it, but she was a lot more interesting than I initially gave her credit for. Her proactivity and strong will are subtle but very present, and they paint a very good picture of a character who suffered so much but still manages to persevere. And that also makes her scene in the palace where she finally tells off Orochi all the more satisfying, even if I think she should have gotten the final blow instead of Denjiro. Some people, including myself, were taken aback by her "the Kuroshima were born to burn" comment from chapter 1057, and it absolutely was an unusual choice, especially for a series with such a large emphasis on family bonds not defining you. On reread, however, I do think this adds some welcome dimension and complexity to Hiyori's character, making her stand apart more from the other princess-type characters, who have all more or less been perfect paragons of justice. Oden is definitely one of the most interesting additions to this arc, in that I feel like for as popular as he is, a lot of people misunderstand his character. He's very reminiscent of Luffy, obviously. He's a free spirit that does what he wants regardless of who opposes him. He naturally attracts people who are unique to fight alongside him, and he has a large appetite and a childlike sense of wonder and curiosity. But beyond that, I think Oden represents a sort of warped version of Luffy that shows how a story like his could have ended in tragedy with a few changes. For one, Oden's superhuman strength and noble status meant that he never really had to struggle to get what he wanted, at least until Whitebeard entered the picture. In addition, him being cooped up in Wano led to his free-spirited nature being amped up to the point that he would try to escape by hanging on the back of a ship for dear life for days on end. You can probably see how these things might make someone difficult to deal with, and I commend Toki, the Scabbards, and Whitebeard for helping him wrangle him into something manageable. Most importantly, I think Oden's story represents a theme that often goes unnoticed in One Piece: the cost of absolute freedom. Most of the time, the world is a zero-sum game. If you really want to pursue your own dreams to the fullest, you may need to leave some things and people behind. We saw this almost come to fruition in Water 7, with Luffy nearly leaving Usopp behind to continue his journey unhindered. And now we have Oden, leaving behind his country and his friends in order to pursue his lifelong dream of traveling the world. Sure, he saw all sorts of wonderful sights and met a lot of important people, but he also left his country defenseless to be ravaged by Orochi and eventually Kaido. This is something that Oden clearly struggles with in the tail end of his flashback, and it's an important bit of nuance in a series that more often than not fully praises the idea of freedom and doing what you want. However, it's important to note that the narrative doesn't explicitly condemn him for this decision so much as it just shows him dealing with the negative fallout from it. One of the things I love about One Piece is that it doesn't portray morality and decisions in black and white, but instead values choices that are made out of a genuine desire to accomplish their dreams, regardless of the means or even the end. Like Luffy freeing the prisoners of Impel Down, sometimes freedom and dreams come at a price, but there's always value in choosing a side for yourself and sticking with it to the end. At the end of the day, I believe Oden was a genuinely good person who matured into a great man worth emulating by the end of his life, with the way he sacrificed his life and his pride for the sake of his people and country that he had previously not cared much for. It's a moving and surprisingly subtle tale of growth and maturity, and I commend Oda for pulling it off with such grace. We managed to catch a peek of Shanks at the tail end of this arc, and this was one of his most intriguing appearances to date. We got to finally get a taste of the full extent of his power, paralyzing a Navy admiral from miles away with his Conqueror's Haki alone. I can see why this power would lead to the world government labeling him as such a massive threat. Shanks' motivations and allegiance continue to remain a mystery, and this arc only served to deepen that mystery further. He seems to be outwardly supportive of Luffy, but his demeanor and dialogue suggest that he may have some ulterior motive or goal that may come at Luffy's expense. Only time will tell if our favorite red-haired emperor will turn out to be friend or foe. Part 3. The Villains. Like any good shonen manga, the villains in One Piece are often just as important as the heroes, so let's go through some of their highlights and relevance. The big man himself. He's been hyped up ever since his smashing entrance at the end of Dressrosa as the strongest creature alive. But did he manage to live up to the expectations? In my opinion, he has indeed. I've never been a huge fan of Kaido. He's always been my least favorite emperor, and honestly still kind of is. But I will admit that this arc drastically raised my opinion of him. His seemingly suicidal motivation and warmongering attitude have a surprising amount of complexity behind them, as his admittedly quite short flashback revealed. He has a brand of anarchism that works extremely well as a foil to Luffy's worldview. Luffy's faced dictators, usurpers, and fascists before, but none of them have mirrored Luffy's ideology before quite like Kaido. Where Luffy's brand of anarchism encourages camaraderie and progress, Kaido's quote-unquote anarchy encourages people to fight with each other for power endlessly, while the strong continue to oppress those beneath them, stagnating society. It's a false freedom where the promise of upward mobility is all but a myth that the powerful benefit from. Kaido himself seems to be bought into this ideology fully, which makes sense for him considering that he's almost always been at top of the food chain in terms of raw power. Speaking of which, Kaido's performance during the raid showed that he was more than worthy of the title of the strongest in the world. 15 opponents and 3 Luffy power-ups over the course of 63 chapters with no breaks, and they still only barely managed to put him down for good. If that's not top-tier level, I don't know what is. And not only that, he didn't fight dirty at all. He faced his final battle with dignity and gave it his full effort, refusing to underestimate his opponents. Even if I feel like the battle was drawn out just a bit too long, I can say for certain that this will go down as one of the most iconic battles in the series' history. Even though Kaido's defeat seemed quite thorough, I feel as though there is a chance that he and Big Mom may have some future relevance, considering that they've fallen right into the place where the ancient weapon Pluton is resting. But I'm getting ahead of myself. For now, let's discuss. Unlike Kaido, Big Mom has long been one of my favorite emperors, second only to Whitebeard in fact. She has a really unique aesthetic that honestly makes her way more terrifying than she has any right to be at times. Her personality and backstory are surprisingly compelling and make for some interesting drama. My only gripe is that Oda often makes the butt of jokes or ridiculed by the rest of the cast, more so than any of the other emperors, except for Buggy, but that's kind of a special case. Case in point, Big Mom spends the first half of her time in Wano stranded alone in a childlike state, and then gets captured and brought before Kaido in chains. But even so, she still remains a legitimate threat, and Act 3 made it clear that she's more than capable of fighting on the same level as Kaido and the other emperors. Her fight against Law and Kid showed off her absolute monster durability, with the two of them only being able to damage her with their costly awakened attacks. And even then she had enough power up her sleeve to bring the two to the brink of exhaustion, to the point that they had to shoot her out of the battlefield to win. Had the circumstances been different, I have no doubt that Big Mom could have pulled off a win against the two of them. Like I said earlier, it looks like Big Mom's role in the story is over for now, but I still think there's a possibility for her to return in some capacity. I actually think that she has some more narrative potential to be explored, even more so than Kaido, who's pretty unequivocally exhausted his relevance as a threat. But even if Big Mom is gone for good, she'll go down as one of the most unique and menacing villains in One Piece's history. King may have had a more minor role than expected, and I'll probably talk more about him in the lore section, but there are some things that I think are worth mentioning. King had a big act to follow after Katakuri, but I believe he measured up in the end. He has one of my favorite designs in the whole series, and his power set is deadly enough for me to believe that he is the second in command of the Beast Pirates. His backstory and origins give him a surprising amount of depth as well. I'd go as far to say he's the only major member of the Beast Pirates that would have turned out to be a decent person if he hadn't fallen in with the wrong crew. His loyalty to Kaido parallels Zoro's own loyalty well, and it makes sense considering how Kaido rescued him from horrific torture and experimentation. However, he seems to have some sort of interest in Joy Boy, implying that he may be waiting for him as well. It's a shame this never got explored more deeply in the arc, but hopefully we'll get more information on that in the future. Unlike King, Queen gets a ton of attention in this arc, and most people love him for how overtly despicable and mean-spirited he is, myself included. He's got so many iconic quotes and moments just in this arc that I can safely say that he's one of, if not my absolute favorite minor antagonist in a One Piece arc. But even aside from that, he has some interesting things going on for him thematically. One of Oda's most interesting hallmarks of writing, I think, is how he uses foils to show character growth and core values. Queen being a scientist, specifically a biologist/engineer, made him a great foil to both Chopper and Sanji, which I talked about earlier in their sections. All the time spent with him exploring his mannerisms and ideology, even as a joke, helped make his eventual comeuppances at the hands of these characters all the more satisfying. Perhaps the most unexpected villain of this arc, Kanjuro was surprisingly entertaining as the misdirecting, mind-breaking tertiary villain of Act 3. What's impressive is that the hints for his betrayal were present from his introduction way back in Dressrosa, but they were subtle enough to be just passed off as just typical Oda goofiness. Using your own tropes and tone to misdirect the audience is really impressive and difficult to pull off, and I commend him for his dedication to making this twist work as well as it did. As for Kanjuro's actions, for as twisted and depraved as they were, one couldn't help but feel bad for him at times. He's so broken and empty that the only things he finds solace in is acting out of character for the sake of one man's petty revenge. He can't even connect with the people he spent literal years with and shared intimate moments with, including the death of their leader, all because he was too broken and brainwashed. His ultimate fate was sad, for sure, but perhaps it was better for him to die like this compared to his life of abuse and manipulation. Orochi is a surprisingly fascinating character for someone who seems at first to be just another one-dimensional wannabe tyrant. I'm writing this part of the script shortly after reading chapter 1057, and it got me thinking about the motivations of Orochi and what led him to this point. Due to his grandfather getting caught assassinating his fellow daimyos to claim the throne, Orochi spent his childhood on the run from vigilantes who sought to extinguish his family name for good. This grueling childhood gave him the sort of vulnerable mentality that allowed him to be manipulated by Kurozumi Higurashi into stealing back the throne and selling out the country to Kaido. But one has to ask, where does one upbringing end and their true personality begin? Orochi continued to act like a petty, cruel, and vindictive tyrant long after Higurashi was killed, and he gained back everything he thought he was owed, so perhaps there is something innate within him that desires this. Was it the country of Wano that made him this way by persecuting him for something that he had no fault in? Was it Higurashi's fault for manipulating him for her own purposes when he was at his most vulnerable and impressionable? Or was it destined to happen like this due to his nature as a person? Characters like Doflamingo and Hody Jones before him raised these questions, and I would go so far as to say it's one of the most important themes in post-timeskip One Piece. I have a lot more to say about the treatment of the Kurozumi persecution by the narrative, but I may make another short video about that in the future. Still, pathos notwithstanding, Kurozumi Orochi is easily one of the most hateable characters that Oda has ever written, right up there with Spandam, Caesar, and many others. His unabashed smugness when confronting his foes, combined with his cowardice in the face of any real threat or challenge, hit just right to make everyone around him root for his downfall. Not to mention that he's committed some of the most horrific actions in the whole series, and that is saying something. What he did to Abisu Town with the Smile Fruits is downright horrific, and it chills me even more than some of the things that happen in One Piece's supposedly darker contemporaries. Needless to say, it was satisfying as hell to see Kaido lop off his big dumb head after he ran his mouth. But of course, he had to survive due to his overpowered Devil Fruit that he doesn't even use properly, damn it. But hey, we still got to see him get taken down for good by Denjiro and Hiyori, two of the people who suffered under him the most. Orochi, you had some good writing, but I'm glad to see you go. Ryokugyu, aka Aramaki, only really showed up in the last few chapters of this arc, so this will be brief. He's been hyped up since the Reverie, and a lot of people were looking forward to seeing him in action for the first time. Needless to say, it wasn't what a lot of people, myself included, were expecting. His conversation with Isho in his introduction seemed to imply that he was quite laid back and maybe even amicable to the Straw Hats' plight. Instead, we were treated to a hardline fascist with a deep admiration for the OG hardline fascist admiral. His declaration of the importance of prejudice and hierarchies was shocking at first glance, but it honestly makes a lot more sense for Aramaki to be more intense than his predecessors. We already have a borderline Luffy sympathizer in the form of Isho, so having Aramaki also be chill with Luffy would tip the scales just a bit too far in his direction. Gotta keep the endgame conflict interesting, you know? His forced Logia powers are also super cool, and they have a lot of potential for interesting fights and mechanics in the future. I don't think he deserves the downplay he gets just for retreating from Shanks, and I think he'll be a worthwhile opponent in the final war. Part 4. The Lore. The land of Wano has been built up as a cornerstone of One Piece's lore for years now, and I think most of us were expecting some major developments in that area. Needless to say, I think this arc delivered in spades. I'll talk about the intermissions in the Odin flashback first, since that's where a good chunk of the lore drops occur. First of all, there's the reveal of the God Valley incident, where Roger and Garp teamed up to take down the pirate Roxy Zebek, who made a crew of the strongest individuals that we know of, such as Whitebeard, Big Mom, and Kaido. Rox is a fascinating character that we know frustratingly little about, but his feats make him sound almost like a mythical character. Corralling the top tiers of this world, launching an attack on the Celestial Dragons, and battling two legends like Garp and Roger at the same time. He almost sounds mythical from these feats. I'm sure we'll get a more in-depth look into his motivations, power, and eventual fate, but I have the feeling that Blackbeard may have something to do with it. His ship is called the Saber of Zebek, and he made his base the former hideout of the Rocks Pirates, so the connection is undoubtedly there. Perhaps he's a bastard son of Zebek who seeks to inherit his dream of absolute power and freedom? Only time will tell. This arc also revealed, or perhaps confirmed, that Wano had a substantial role in the events of the Void Century and the true nature of the One Piece. It was revealed that it was the people of Wano, specifically the Kozuki clan, that carved the immutable and indestructible poneglyphs and inscribed it with their secret language. Not to mention that one of the all-powerful ancient weapons is apparently buried under its surface. I've heard some theories that Wano may in fact be the ancient kingdom that was vanquished by the world government 800 years ago, but I think it's more likely that they were very good allies, or perhaps a branch off after the Void Century ended. Either way, Wano will almost certainly remain relevant throughout the upcoming final saga. The Lunarians were also introduced by the way of King, and I think they will have some substantial role in the future from the way that they were presented. We learn that the Lunarians are/were a race of winged extremophiles with the ability to conjure fire from their bodies and shrug off even the most brutal damage. Their name implies that they have origins on the moon, like the Skypians, Birkins, and Shandians. They lived on top of the Red Line and were revered as gods in the distant past, but they apparently went near extinct at some point in the past, perhaps the Void Century? I have a hunch that they had some connections to the unnamed ancient kingdom, and may have been their upper class, or even objects of worship. Hopefully, we'll get the answer to these questions in the upcoming arcs. The name Joy Boy has been cropping up in the story ever since Fishman Island, but Wano was the first time that we got any substantial information about this mythical figure. We already knew that he was involved with the writing of the poneglyphs from the aforementioned Fishman Island, but now we know that he was also the one who left something on the final island of Laugh-Tale for a future adventurer to find, something that is apparently pretty darn funny. But perhaps the biggest indicator of his personality came from the reveal of Luffy's Nika fruit, which means we'll be going back to the Gear 5 corner. Zunisha brings up Joy Boy when Luffy is in the process of awakening, undeniably linking the two concepts together. Whether this indicates that Joy Boy was the previous person to awaken the Gomu Gomu no Mi, or perhaps that he was the original inspiration for the myth of Nika remains to be seen. But either way, this gives us some insight into what Joy Boy may have been like all those years ago. His namesake seems to be quite literal, as he was someone who brought joy and freedom to the oppressed and despairing, much like Luffy does in the current era. Perhaps he was the final rival to Eam in the encroaching world government during the conflict in the Void Century, if the Eam received the immortality surgery theory holds any water. Joy Boy will undoubtedly come up sooner rather than later, if Luffy continues to explore the mechanics of his Devil Fruit. Speaking of which, the Gear 5 reveal brings up some interesting points of discussion about the nature of Devil Fruits. I've always had a sneaking suspicion that the Paramecia Zoanlogia classification was flawed and limiting in-universe, due to several unusual Devil Fruits, and this reveal all but confirms it. Kaido goes out of his way to bring up how odd it is that Luffy's awakening can manipulate the environment like a Paramecia, but has a bodily transformation like a Zoan. Luffy's fruit straddling the classification system may be more than a clerical error, though. Personally, I think there are some hidden mechanics at work here. My theory, / blind speculation, is that Devil Fruits can assimilate with their users through some means, but once they reach a high enough level, which would explain why Luffy's fruit behaves like a Paramecia for most of the time it's used, and only reveals its true nature once awakened. This opens the door to a ton of possibilities and speculation. Could there be other Devil Fruits with hidden attributes upon awakening? Were there other individuals who impressed themselves upon Devil Fruits in the past? And what could be the prerequisites for becoming the subject of a mythical Zoan fruit? We may have to wait quite a while for these answers, or at least until Vegapunk is introduced into the story. More importantly, what do you all think? I would love to get some theory crafting going in the comments if you all have ideas. Final thoughts. So, the question is probably on all of your minds. Where would I rank this arc next to those that came before it? Well, that's a complicated issue. I don't think that there's any part of this arc that absolutely decimates its credibility, but there are more than a few things holding it back from true greatness. Poor pacing at crucial points, some missed storytelling potential, lack of tension regarding deaths, and a somewhat rushed conclusion, to name a few. But even so, this arc had so many all-time iconic and heart-pounding moments that I can't even call it a mediocre or even just okay arc. For reference, here is my personal tier list for every current One Piece arc. Pause for the people typing their comments, talking about my ship taste. And here is where I'd place Wano in that tier list. For reference, I consider everything above S tier to be peak One Piece writing. Wano is hovering right at the border of A and S tier, which I think is a pretty accurate indicator of its status in my opinion. Some peak moments for sure, but too many underlying structural issues to fully appreciate them. Still, I think it's a perfectly reasonable ranking for an arc of such importance as this. As for a ranking out of 10, I'd probably say somewhere in the range of a low to mid 8 out of 10. Perhaps this is just recency bias talking, and the general opinion of this arc will shift as the years pass, but for now I think this is an accurate depiction of where I stand. Wano has been a wild ride, with plenty of ups and downs and twists and turns. And while I'm glad to be heading off to the next adventure, I will miss the iconic atmosphere, charming characters, and compelling drama of this monumental arc. I hope you enjoyed this look back at the Wano arc, and if you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe if you want to hear more of me and my friends talking about anime. Comment down below if you have any thoughts, or if you would like to see any more series-specific analysis of content like this. This has been Noah of the Anime Connoisseurs. Good night, everybody.